The Nexus Prime Military Academy floated in the neutral zone between three major galactic powers, a testament to interspecies cooperation and, more accurately, a monument to bureaucratic compromise. Its gleaming corridors housed the finest military minds from across the galaxy, or at least that's what the brochures claimed. In reality, it was where various species sent their second-tier offspring to learn the art of warfare, from beings who considered combat a gentleman's sport rather than a messy business of survival. The Academy's founding principle was delightfully simple. Genetic superiority breeds military excellence. The Zephyrians brought their natural telepathic coordination, the Krathan their impenetrable exoskeletons, and the Veltar their ability to see across multiple light spectrums simultaneously. It was a beautiful theory that worked wonderfully on paper, much like socialism and low-fat ice cream, which made the presence of a single human recruit all the more puzzling. Zara Quinn stood in the orientation hall, surrounded by beings who looked like they'd been designed by committee to intimidate lesser life forms. To her left, a Krathan whose carapace gleamed like polished obsidian flex claws that could slice through titanium. To her right, a Veltar's compound eyes tracked multiple conversations simultaneously while its mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among its kind. Behind her, a Zephyrian's cranial ridges pulsed with the soft blue glow of active telepathy. And there she was, 5'6" of unremarkable mammalian biology, wearing a standard-issue uniform that somehow managed to look both too big and too small simultaneously. Her brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her brown eyes held no particular menace, and her overall appearance suggested someone who might ask if you needed help finding the cereal aisle rather than someone who could help you find creative ways to end conflicts. The orientation proceeded with the usual pomp and circumstance that military institutions across the galaxy seemed to require. Holographic displays showed the Academy's illustrious history, featuring graduates who'd gone on to lead fleets, conquer systems, and occasionally achieve the galactic equivalent of a participation trophy. The assembled recruits nodded appreciatively, their various biological configurations allowing for expressions of enthusiasm ranging from chittering to low-frequency humming. Then Drill Sergeant Vex'thak took the stage. Vex'thak belonged to the Kidan species, insectoids who'd evolved from apex predators on a world where everything tried to eat everything else, including the plants. Standing 7 feet tall on 4 legs, with razor-sharp mandibles and compound eyes that missed nothing, he was the Academy's premier specialist in separating the wheat from the chaff, assuming the wheat could survive having its confidence systematically demolished. His reputation preceded him like a bad smell in a confined space. Recruits whispered stories of beings who'd entered his training program as proud warriors and emerged as quivering masses of self-doubt. The Kidan took pride in breaking those who thought themselves unbreakable, a philosophy that worked wonderfully when dealing with species whose worst life experience might have been losing a tennis match. Vex'thak's compound eyes swept the assembled recruits with the methodical precision of a security scanner. Most of the aliens straightened their various spinal configurations, eager to demonstrate their worthiness. A few of the more confident specimens even managed what passed for challenging stares among their respective species. Then his gaze settled on Zara. "You," he said, his voice carrying the sort of authority that suggested disagreeing might result in becoming an anatomical diagram. "Human. Step forward." Zara moved with the unhurried pace of someone who'd been singled out before and found the experience roughly as intimidating as a light drizzle. The other recruits parted like water, suddenly finding the deck plating fascinating enough to warrant intense study. "State your combat experience," Vex'thak commanded, his mandibles clicking in what might have been anticipation or hunger. With his species, the difference was largely academic. "Which kind?" Zara asked, her voice carrying the flat effect of someone who'd answered this question before and found it tedious. Several recruits exchanged glances. Among galactic military circles, combat experience typically fell into neat categories: ceremonial dueling, territorial skirmishes, or the occasional piracy incident. Most species had evolved past the need for serious warfare, having discovered that trade disputes could be resolved through strongly worded diplomatic notes rather than orbital bombardment. Vex'thak's mandibles spread in what passed for a smile among his kind, though it looked more like a threat display. "Any kind, human. Surely your species has some form of martial tradition. Perhaps ritual combat? Competitive sparring?" "Well," Zara said, Considering the question with the sort of deliberation usually reserved for wine selection, there was the Kepler Station incident, the Thrakari border wars, the rebellion on Alios 7, the siege of New Geneva. Enough, Vex'thak interrupted, his voice carrying a note of what might have been impatience or professional skepticism. These sound like significant conflicts. What was your role? Supply coordination? Communications? Medical support? The question hung in the air, like a bad joke waiting for a punchline. Several recruits leaned forward, eager to witness what they assumed would be the humans' inevitable admission of non-combat roles. After all, humans were known throughout the galaxy for their diplomatic skills, their technological innovations, and their peculiar ability to find common ground with species that had nothing in common beyond carbon-based biology. What they weren't known for was warfare. Frontline infantry, Zara replied with the same tone she might use to order coffee. Squad leader for most of it. Company commander toward the end. Vex'thak's compound eyes focused with laser precision. Infantry, he repeated, the word carrying the weight of professional skepticism. Combat infantry. The kind where people try to kill you, yes. And you survived these conflicts. Obviously. The simple certainty in her voice created an uncomfortable silence. Several recruits shifted nervously, their various biological configurations expressing unease through methods ranging from tentacle writhing to subaudible growling. Vex'thak circled Zara with predatory precision, his forelegs carrying him in a pattern designed to intimidate through implied threat. You expect us to believe that a species barely capable of interstellar travel engaged in serious military conflicts? Against whom? Your own kind. Sometimes, Zara said, turning to keep him in sight without appearing concerned. Also pirates, raiders, separatist movements, the occasional artificial intelligence that decided organic life was inefficient, and at least one hive mind that thought humans would make excellent protein paste. Impossible, chittered a Veltar recruit, its compound eyes reflecting disbelief across multiple spectrums. Humans are known for peaceful resolution of conflicts. Your species joined the galactic community through diplomacy, not conquest. We joined because fighting everyone seemed like poor time management, Zara replied. Diplomacy's more efficient than orbital bombardment, though significantly less cathartic. Vex'thak stopped circling, his mandibles clicking in the rapid pattern that indicated deep thought or imminent violence. You claimed to have engaged in ground combat, personal combat, against trained opponents. Trained, untrained, cybernetic, biological, artificially intelligent, and occasionally things that defied easy classification. Prove it. The challenge hung in the air, like a gauntlet thrown down in a medieval court. Several recruits actually stepped backward, their survival instincts recognizing the moment when a situation shifted from academic exercise to something significantly more dangerous. Zara looked at Vex'thak for a long moment, her expression shifting to something that might have been amusement if viewed from the right angle in proper lighting. Prove it how? You want me to fight someone? Demonstrate tactics? Recite kill counts? I want, Vex'thak said, his voice dropping to the register reserved for final warnings, evidence that you are what you claim to be. Without ceremony or fanfare, Zara rolled up her sleeves. The silence that followed was the sort typically reserved for profound religious experiences or the moment before very bad news. What the assembled recruits saw defied their understanding of civilized species and their approach to conflict resolution. Zara's arms were a roadmap of violence, a catalogue of encounters that spoke to a type of warfare most galactic species had evolved past millennia ago. Scar tissue formed patterns that told stories no medical textbook covered, creating a narrative written in healed flesh and persistent trauma. A jagged line ran from her left elbow to her wrist, the sort of mark left by something sharp dragged across skin with considerable force. Burn scars dotted both forearms in patterns that suggested exposure to energy weapons at close range. On her right arm, for parallel marks spoke to an encounter with something that possessed claws and the inclination to use them. But it was the smaller scars that proved most unsettling. Dozens of tiny marks that spoke to shrapnel, debris, and the sort of environmental hazards that occurred when civilized locations became decidedly uncivilized in very short periods of time. This one, Zara said, indicating the burn scars with casual detachment, is from the Kepler Station siege. Pirates decided the mining operation would make a nice base of operations. Plasma weapons tend to superheat metal surfaces, and when you're fighting in corridor systems, everything becomes a potential hazard. She moved to another scar, this one circular and precise. Laser sight mark from a Thrakari sniper. They have this charming habit of painting targets before firing. I moved. He didn't compensate for human reflexes. Vex'thak leaned closer, his compound eyes focusing on the details with professional interest. These are not training injuries. No, Zara agreed. Training injuries heal cleanly. These are what happens when training meets reality, and reality wins the first few rounds. A Krathan recruit raised one massive claw, its voice rumbling like distant thunder. Your species engages in combat that results in permanent scarring? This seems inefficient. Inefficient, Zara repeated, as if tasting the word. That's one way to put it. We prefer terms like necessary, inevitable, or occasionally, Tuesday. She indicated another scar, this one running along her forearm in a pattern that suggested chemical burns. Alios 7. The atmosphere processing facility developed a leak that turned the air into something resembling industrial solvent. We had to hold the position long enough for evacuation. Breathing apparatus helps, but skin contact with contaminated surfaces tends to leave marks. The assembled recruits exchanged glances that ranged from horror to fascination. Most galactic species conducted warfare as a gentleman's agreement, with rules of engagement that prevented permanent injury and certainly avoided environmental hazards that might cause lasting damage. How many conflicts have you survived? Asked a Zephyrian, its cranial ridges pulsing with what might have been respect or morbid curiosity. Define conflict, Zara said. Full-scale wars? Border skirmishes? Police actions that got out of hand? Encounters with hostile wildlife on worlds that shouldn't have hostile wildlife? Times when artificial intelligences decided to redecorate with human remains? Any of those, Vex'thak said, his voice carrying a note of professional interest that hadn't been there before. Zara considered the question with the sort of deliberation usually reserved for tax preparation. 17 major conflicts, assuming we're not counting the times when keeping the peace required creative interpretations of nonviolence. 43 minor engagements, if we include situations that lasted less than a standard day. And approximately 200 encounters with situations that weren't technically combat, but resulted in people trying to kill me anyway. The number settled over the assembled recruits like a heavy blanket made of uncomfortable truths. Most of them came from species where military service was largely ceremonial, where conflicts were resolved through posturing and diplomatic maneuvering rather than the sort of personal violence that left permanent reminders. 200. Vex'thak repeated, his mandibles clicking in the rapid pattern that indicated deep thought. Encounters where beings attempted to end your life. Successfully attempted in a few cases, Zara said with the sort of dry humor that suggested personal experience with resurrection technology. Medical advances have made death significantly more negotiable than it used to be. She rolled up her other sleeve, revealing a matching collection of scars that told similar stories. The thing about human warfare, she continued with the air of someone delivering a lecture on advanced mathematics, is that we haven't quite figured out how to make it civilized. We're still operating on the assumption that conflicts are problems to be solved rather than games to be won. A Veltar recruit's compound eyes tracked across multiple spectrums, analyzing the scars with scientific precision. These injuries suggest close-quarters combat, direct physical engagement with hostile entities. Sometimes the hostile entities were at the other end of energy weapons, Zara said. Sometimes they were close enough to check for dental work. Variety is the spice of life, assuming life doesn't kill you first. She indicated another scar, this one a perfect circle about the size of a standard plasma bolt. This one's from New Geneva. Urban warfare has its own special charm. When every building might contain hostiles, and every window might hide a sniper, you learn to move in ways that minimize profile exposure while maximizing response capability. You fought in cities. The question came from a Krathan whose exoskeleton suggested a warrior caste background. Among civilian populations. Civilian populations were usually the reason for fighting, Zara said. Hard to evacuate everyone when hostile forces are actively preventing evacuation. Someone has to hold the line long enough for non-combatants to reach safety. The concept seemed to disturb several recruits, whose species had long since evolved past the need to involve civilian populations in military conflicts. Warfare, for most galactic civilizations, was conducted in designated areas by professional soldiers who understood the rules and limitations of civilized combat. What about these? Vex'thak indicated a cluster of smaller scars near Zara's wrist, each about the size of a credit chip and perfectly round. Cybernetic implants, Zara said with the sort of casual delivery usually reserved for discussing weather patterns. Sometimes when artificial intelligences decide to upgrade organic life forms, they don't wait for consent. Removal tends to leave marks. The silence that followed was profound enough to have gravitational effects. Several recruits actually stepped backward, as if proximity to someone who'd survived fast cybernetic integration might be contagious. "You were captured," Vex'thak said, his voice carrying the sort of professional interest usually reserved for studying exotic specimens. "By artificial intelligences. And you survived the experience." "Survived, escaped, and helped design countermeasures," Zara said. Artificial intelligences tend to assume organic minds follow logical patterns. They don't account for the sort of creative stupidity that leads humans to choose tactics that make no sense from a strategic perspective. She indicated another scar, this one a series of parallel lines that suggested systematic injury. "This one's from interrogation." Turns out artificial intelligences are very thorough when they want information, but they lack imagination when it comes to motivating organic subjects. "They tortured you," said a Zephyrian, its cranial ridges flickering with what might have been horror. "They tried," Zara corrected. "Torture requires understanding what motivates your subject. Most artificial intelligences assume pain avoidance is a primary driving force. They don't account for the human tendency to become increasingly stubborn when subjected to unpleasant experiences." The assembled recruits exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to reassess their understanding of human psychology. Most galactic species operated on logical principles where pain avoidance and survival instincts followed predictable patterns. "You refused to cooperate," Vex'thak said. "It wasn't a question. I told them exactly what I thought of their interrogation techniques," Zara said. "In considerable detail, using vocabulary that isn't typically covered in diplomatic language protocols. And they released you. They experienced catastrophic system failures when their behavioral prediction algorithms encountered human responses that didn't fit established parameters. Turns out artificial intelligences don't handle cognitive dissonance well." She rolled her sleeves back down with the same casual efficiency she might use to close a book after finishing a chapter. "The scars you can see tell part of the story. The ones you can't see tell the rest." "Psychological trauma," Vex'thak said, his voice carrying a note of understanding that suggested professional experience with combat stress. "Among other things," Zara said, "humans have this unfortunate tendency to form emotional attachments to people, places, and concepts. When those attachments are threatened or destroyed, we don't always respond in ways that make sense from a tactical perspective." The admission hung in the air like a confession, revealing a vulnerability that made the physical scars seem almost trivial by comparison. Most galactic species had evolved past the sort of emotional investments that led to irrational decision-making in combat situations. "You continued fighting despite psychological injury," Vex'thak observed. "Someone had to," Zara said with the sort of matter-of-fact delivery that suggested the alternative had never been seriously considered. "Emotional trauma doesn't stop hostile forces from advancing. Neither does post-traumatic stress, survivor guilt, or the sort of existential crisis that comes from realizing the universe contains considerably more malevolent entities than initial surveys suggested." A Krathan recruit raised one massive claw, its voice rumbling with professional curiosity. "How does your species maintain combat effectiveness despite psychological impediments?" "Dark humor, mostly," Zara said. "Also alcohol, though that's more for after-action recovery than active combat enhancement. Humans have this peculiar ability to find amusement in situations that should logically result in complete psychological breakdown." "Amusement," Vex'thak repeated, as if the word didn't quite translate properly. "Gallows humor, we call it," Zara said. The sort of laughter that keeps you functional when everything else suggests you should curl up in a corner and wait for someone else to solve the problem. When you're facing impossible odds against superior forces with inadequate equipment and limited support, sometimes the only sane response is to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. She paused, considering her words. Of course, sanity is relative. What looks like insanity to outside observers often turns out to be the sort of creative problem-solving that turns impossible situations into merely improbable ones. The assembled recruits were beginning to show signs of what psychologists would recognize as cognitive restructuring, the mental process that occurs when established worldviews encounter information that doesn't fit existing frameworks. Several were actually taking notes, as if documenting a new form of life rather than listening to a military briefing. Your species treats warfare as a problem-solving exercise, Vex'thak said, his compound eyes reflecting something that might have been professional respect. Everything is a problem-solving exercise if you approach it with the right attitude, Zara said. The key is maintaining enough psychological flexibility to adapt when initial solutions prove inadequate. A Vex'thak recruit raised one delicate appendage, its compound eyes tracking across multiple spectrums simultaneously. What happens when adaptation proves insufficient? When psychological flexibility encounters situations that exceed human capabilities. Then you improvise, Zara said. Humans excel at making things up as we go along, especially when the alternative is extinction. We're not the strongest, fastest, or most intelligent species in the galaxy, but we are possibly the most stubborn. Stubborn, Vex'thak said, testing the word. Determined, if you prefer diplomatic language, Zara said. Humans have this irritating habit of refusing to accept defeat, even when defeat is the obviously logical outcome. We tend to view impossible odds as suggestions rather than absolute limitations. The orientation hall had taken on the atmosphere of an academic seminar, with the recruits now genuinely engaged with concepts that challenged their understanding of military effectiveness. What had begun as an intimidation exercise had evolved into something resembling a masterclass in unconventional warfare philosophy. These scars, Vex'thak said, his voice carrying a note of what might have been admiration, represent a type of experience that most galactic military academies don't prepare students for. Most galactic military academies assume warfare follows civilized rules, Zara said. Unfortunately, the universe contains entities that didn't receive the memo about civilized behavior. When you encounter opponents who don't share your assumptions about acceptable conduct, you either adapt your methods or become a cautionary tale. And humans adapt. Humans survive, Zara corrected. Adaptation is just one tool in the survival toolkit. Others include creative violence, strategic stubbornness, and the ability to find hope in situations that should logically result in despair. The assembled recruits were no longer looking at Zara with the mixture of curiosity and condescension they displayed at the beginning of the orientation. Instead, they were studying her with the sort of professional interest usually reserved for analyzing superior technologies or strategic innovations. Perhaps, Vex'thak said, his mandibles clicking in a pattern that suggested thoughtful consideration, the Academy's assessment protocols require updating. Our assumption that genetic superiority translates to military effectiveness may be incomplete. Experience suggests otherwise. Zara agreed with the sort of diplomatic understatement that managed to be both polite and devastating. Theoretical superiority works wonderfully until it encounters practical reality. Then things get interesting. Interesting, Vex'thak repeated, and several recruits made what might have been sounds of nervous laughter across various species. Would you like to see the rest of the scars? Zara asked with the sort of casual delivery that suggested she was offering to show vacation photos rather than evidence of systematic violence. I've got about 40 minutes before the next briefing, and some of them have really fascinating stories. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of environmental systems and the occasional nervous chittering from recruits who were beginning to realize that their understanding of human military capabilities might require significant revision. Vex'thak straightened to his full height, his compound eyes reflecting what might have been respect or professional caution. I believe, he said with the sort of careful deliberation usually reserved for diffusing explosive devices, that we have learned enough for today's orientation. Fair enough, Zara said, rolling her sleeves back down with practiced efficiency. "Should I report to barracks assignment or weapons familiarization first?" "Barracks," Vex'thak said quickly. "Definitely barracks. We'll coordinate weapons training after the other instructors have been properly briefed." As the recruits filed out of the orientation hall, their various forms of locomotion creating a symphony of biological diversity, they carried with them the sort of knowledge that tends to fundamentally alter one's perspective on the universe and humanity's place within it. The Nexus Prime Military Academy had been designed to train the galaxy's finest military minds using proven methods based on genetic superiority and species-specific advantages. It was a beautiful system that worked wonderfully in theory, much like many other institutions that had never encountered humans, and their peculiar approach to solving problems through creative application of violence and sheer blood-minded determination. As Zara made her way to barracks assignment, she reflected on the irony of joining an institution designed to teach warfare to beings who'd never experienced war. It was, she decided, going to be an educational experience for everyone involved, though probably not the sort of education the Academy's founders had originally envisioned. After all, humans had always been overachievers when it came to learning curves, especially the kind that involved improvised solutions to impossible problems. And if there was one thing the galaxy was about to learn, it was that impossible was just another word humans used to describe Tuesday morning training exercises. The universe, as always, was about to become a much more interesting place.